Hello, my name is Kira. Welcome to the Scientific Python interviews. Today we have Isabela from Quansight, who will tell us everything about how she contributes to open source as a UX/UI designer. Hello, Isabela. Please introduce yourself.
Hi there, I am Isabela, pronouns are she, her, and Kira's absolutely right. I am a UX UI designer by name. What that means sometimes in different projects really varies depending on what they need. But yeah, I contribute to, I've contributed to a bunch of different projects. Some of the ones I have active right now are JupyterLab, Spyder, and starting with Napari, but I've also spent some time with some design in NumPy and PyTorch, and now I'm not remembering. Basically, I've been all over the place because there aren't a lot of designers here, and then word spreads fast sometimes. But that's also been really cool to work with so many different people. So yeah, that's what I'm up to. Oh, and I spend a lot of time on accessibility stuff across projects too. So
Yeah, that's super cool. Definitely there's a lot of excitement for UI and UX designers since, as you mentioned, there's not many of them. And on that topic, how did you get into open source? What drove you to contribute to it?
Yeah, I kind of have a weird path, at least for this space, right? A lot of people here have worked with these projects, right? They've started, they were doing research in one kind of thing and used it. And then they were like, oh, this is so cool, I can contribute, and kind of got here that way. That was not the case at all for me. I did actually study design more broadly. And so that was not something that we ever talked about that used, but my family are not designers, and some of them have spent a lot of time in tech and had kind of a vague enthusiasm for open source that I always remembered. And so I didn't have a clear concept of it when I was a kid, but I kind of was like, wow, Mozilla's the heroes. And so I was just like, this is a cool thing. And then growing up, also one of my favorite things was science. And so when I started looking at careers for things, I ended up in design for other reasons. But then when I was looking around for what people did with that, I started seeing words, kind of like keywords, but not understanding how they were used together. I saw open source and I saw science. And that's actually how I stumbled into JupyterLab. I was I have no clue how people are using this, but I like all these words separately, so I will probably like them together. But yeah.
Yeah, that's cool. And it's really interesting that your family somewhat knew or talked about open source. Yeah, don't hear that all that often. But
I think it just makes me sound really young, but yeah.
Really young? I don't know about that, but
Okay.
Definitely a more interesting path than I think most of us. So then what has been the greatest challenge about working with open source for you?
Well, there's been a few for sure, but I guess one I want to start with, to make it clear, some designers do spend a lot of time coding. I don't. And I think that's really important to say to people, because I know sometimes there's this illusion of that is the only way you can contribute. And there is a lot of power in it. I will not deny that. You can do a lot of things if that's how you're contributing. But that was an initial obstacle I really had. For example, I had no Git background. That was not something that I learned anywhere until I got here. But I was really fortunate that I was part of a mentoring program that was okay, let's get people started, and that they were interested in getting people started, like designers, right? That weren't just doing that. So that was one obstacle, was getting kind of comfortable with the collaboration tools being used. But then on top of that, there's always kind of this obstacle. I would say I've been really lucky. Everybody's been super excited to have designers here, right? Because most of them are like, ooh, this is a shiny new thing. I've worked with so many people that have never worked with a designer before. I caught them Googling, what is a UX UI designer in the background, which is super cool. No problem with that. But right. So I haven't had bad experiences with new people generally, and I'm really lucky. But at the same time, that means there's not a good path for me to follow sometimes. A lot of the time we're working with unknowns kind of constantly. And that's as cool as it is challenging sometimes. It's really awesome that I can approach projects and be like, okay, what's going to work for you? What's going to help you most? What's kind of this give and take that I can help you out with? But it also means sometimes I'm like, what am I doing here? How have I gotten myself in over my head yet again? But in the end, I don't feel like you ever have. It's a community. We work together. And even when I think I've gotten myself into something that I can't possibly fix, we always figure it out together, and that's really cool. Yeah.
Oh, that's so sentimental.
It is sentimental.
But yeah, I'm really glad that the community has been helpful with you, and that they're as excited as I am about having UX designers in open source, because I think a lot of open source projects definitely lack that element, and it can sometimes, be not so great.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So how is working in open source different from other projects that you've worked on before?
I mean, a lot of ways, right? That's the obvious answer, but I think the thing that I always come back to when I'm kind of unsure, because there are struggles here that sometimes I'm like, I never had to deal with this, when we had a dedicated team and I was working in a very closed source space. But I think of it a lot like the people that I get to collaborate with. It's so cool. How can I just work from people doing all these different things? They all have all these different projects, all this different research, and it's all amazing. And so it just excites me to kind of have that. And that is really different, right? In other places, I had a very set team with very rigid roles. And even if I really liked that team, it was okay, Isabella, you can't do that thing. It's not your job. And I think that's not really my attitude. I like to be able to jump into things and learn. And so that's something that I think I've noticed is really different. I was okay, I'm going to go try this new thing I haven't done before. And people are okay, give it a go. And that's cool.
Yeah, that's really awesome. You're able to, get your feet wet with all sorts of different interests that you might have. That's something I definitely relate to a lot too, because it's fun to be kind of a jack of all trades, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
So I'm glad that you get the freedom to go work on all of that stuff as part of open source. So then what are you doing to make the open source community better? How are you giving back?
I think participating, at all, because sometimes I get myself hung up on better. What does that mean? How do we know? But, interacting, I think, might very much be a way. But there are some specific things I focus on. I got into design actually because I liked it, as a support role when I started looking at jobs and not just things that I thought were cool to study. That was a point in my life where I was this is cool, but I don't want that job. And so I liked it, that it is filling in gaps. And I feel that's been even more amplified working in these spaces, because the gaps can be really big sometimes when you're just working with these community-driven projects. So I would say overall, that's what I try and do, is I try and notice where is their absence. So that can be I run some community calls for Jupyter spaces, cross-project calls there. So community work is important to me. I also mentioned I spend a lot of time on accessibility, because that's something that is not always brought up in a lot of spaces. That's not just open source, but right, it's very transparent here, because you can see a lot of projects don't have issues on that, don't have a label. That hasn't really been something that they've thought about. And of course, the design itself, depending on the project, can be a real gap. So I think it's trying to be okay, can we at least get some thoughts in that, and trying to help other people think that way. That's been one of my favorites. I've spent some time with Spyder where it's been really cool. That when I first started, sometimes you'll see I ask the same questions where I was just okay, but is this how the pattern works elsewhere? People are going to learn and expect interactions. And now after working with them for a while, sometimes I catch them on issues, being asking a contributor does this follow the pattern? And I'm that's so cool. See, right, they may not have, the title or whatever, but that we're sharing these ideas and getting each other to think about problems. So that I think is bettering, like just bringing your own skills. They may not seem like a big thing to you, but they probably are to someone else. You may be the first time someone's heard of an idea you have, even if it's not a new idea to you.
Yeah, no, that's great. It's really great that you're getting people to think more about accessibility and addressing that in the open source community.
It's a long process, but I mean, it's a critical one. I don't think we can continue like this. I'm not okay with it, at least.
Oh yeah, for sure. It's a super important issue. So why do you think someone should consider joining the open source community, and what advice would you give to potential contributors?
Why is a little bit tricky because there's, I think, so many reasons, and they really depend on who you are. Like what matters most to you. Some people do it to learn new skills. Some people do it because they're like, ethically, I think, this is something I should do because I use these products, right? Or like those kind of things. But I think especially if you're joining as a volunteer, right? I'm fortunate enough that this is my job now and I'm super stoked. But especially if you're just volunteering, like you have maybe more choices than you even know. There's so many projects and so many different skills and so many, like from the scale of the most niche thing that you want to learn to like the biggest scale you want to start thinking big picture. You can definitely find that sometimes even in the same project, but even if you can't, there's so many of them. So I guess I would just tell people, like, if you want to learn and you want to learn from often really amazing people who sometimes it's unbelievable that they're willing to just talk to you, but they're like, no, because that's what happens in this space. I would definitely say that that's like a great place to be doing this. And advice, I guess, something I wish I had told me is sometimes how I approach advice. Like looking back, like you'll always kind of feel like you don't know what you're doing, and you probably know more than you think you do, or, maybe it doesn't matter, right? It's learning. And so I guess, like I said, I didn't know pretty much any code stuff coming in, like not very negligible. So that I wouldn't say like let that stop you. There's lots of people doing code. I'm not saying people don't want more of that, but also there's other things too that they may have like an absolute zero of, and even just your little bit makes a really big difference. So I guess be kind with yourself in those senses and just, why not try it? There's a lot of different things out there for you to try. It's pretty amazing.
Yeah, that's some great advice. I definitely agree a lot with it. Definitely you don't want to like limit yourself because you think that whatever, like your skill set might not match or anything like that, because I feel like with open source there's always some use for how you can contribute. But it was great having you on, Isabela. Thank you so much for letting us interview you.
Yeah, well, thank you for inviting me. I'm super honored. I hope we can get more people doing different skills out here.
Mm-hmm.